When God aligns two souls, it never happens by accident, and it never happens early. What looks like chance from the outside is usually the final stage of a long internal process. Each person arrives at that moment, having already been shaped by solitude, disappointment, and struggle. From a psychological perspective, this preparation is essential. A fragmented individual cannot sustain a meaningful union without projecting unmet needs onto the other. Jung warned that when we are not individuated, we mistake longing for destiny. God's timing, however, is precise. Alignment occurs only after both souls have confronted their own shadow, after illusion has been stripped away, and responsibility has been accepted. This is why divine connections often appear later than expected and arrive quietly without drama. They don't overwhelm the nervous system, they stabilize it. You don't feel rescued, you feel grounded. The alignment is not about completing what is missing, but about uniting what has been made whole. And that distinction matters, because it determines whether the relationship becomes a source of growth or a refuge for avoidance. When preparation precedes alignment, the bond doesn't collapse under pressure. It deepens through it. So, if you are waiting, consider this. Perhaps nothing is delayed. Perhaps you are being formed into someone capable of recognizing what truly matters when it finally arrives. When two souls are truly aligned by God, recognition does not arrive as excitement. It arrives as clarity. There is a quiet familiarity that bypasses logic and settles somewhere deeper than emotion. Psychologically, this is not projection or fantasy, it is resonance. Jung described this as a meeting in the unconscious, where patterns shaped by truth recognize one another without negotiation. You are not performing, impressing, or striving to be seen. You are simply present, and that presence is enough. This is why divine alignment feels steady rather than intoxicating. Infatuation demands constant stimulation. Soul recognition brings calm. There is an intuitive trust, a sense that conversation doesn't have to fill silence because meaning already exists beneath it. Spiritually, this recognition reflects unity of direction rather than similarity of personality. Two people may differ in temperament, background, or expression, yet move toward the same values, the same sense of responsibility, the same call toward meaning. That shared orientation creates understanding without explanation, and this is critical because relationships rooted only in emotion collapse when emotion fades. But recognition at the soul level endures because it is anchored in truth, not mood. So the question is not whether you feel strongly, but whether you feel oriented. If a connection brings clarity instead of confusion, peace instead of urgency, and depth instead of performance, pay attention. That may be recognition doing its quiet, transformative work. When God aligns two souls, the purpose is rarely comfort. In fact, alignment often disrupts comfort before it ever provides peace. Psychologically speaking, comfort can be a subtle form of stagnation. Jung argued that growth demands tension, the tension between who we are and who we are called to become. A divinely aligned relationship introduces that tension deliberately. It awakens responsibility, sharpens conscience, and exposes areas where discipline has been avoided. Instead of soothing your weaknesses, the other person seems to activate your potential. You find yourself compelled to speak more honestly, act more courageously, and live with greater intentionality. This can feel unsettling at first, because the relationship no longer allows you to hide behind old patterns or excuses. Spiritually, this is the point. God does not align souls to distract them from their calling, but to anchor them more firmly within it. Purpose requires structure, and structure requires accountability. A meaningful union, therefore, becomes a forge rather than a refuge. It strengthens not by indulgence, but by refinement. And this is how you know the alignment is real. It doesn't make life easier in superficial ways. It makes you stronger in essential ones. So if a connection challenges you to rise rather than retreat, to build rather than escape, consider that a sign. Comfort can be found anywhere. Purpose must be lived, and often it must be lived together. When two souls are aligned under God's will, the relationship becomes a mirror, and not a flattering one. This is where many people grow uncomfortable, because we often seek connection to be affirmed, not revealed. Yet psychologically, revelation is essential. Jung emphasized that growth requires confrontation with the shadow, and aligned souls inevitably bring that shadow into view. The other person does not merely see your strengths. They sense your evasions, your unintegrated fears, the patterns you've learned to protect rather than transform. This exposure is not cruel, it is precise. There is a strange honesty in these connections, where pretense feels exhausting and avoidance becomes impossible. You are not being judged, but you are being invited to mature. Spiritually, this mirroring is an act of love rooted in truth. God does not heal through illusion. He heals through clarity, and clarity can be uncomfortable. Aligned souls reflect not only who you are, but who you could become if you stopped negotiating with your own limitations. This is why such relationships demand humility. You must choose whether to defend the ego or refine the character. And here is the critical insight. The mirror will not disappear simply because you look away. So the question becomes one of courage. Will you use what is revealed to grow, or will you retreat into what feels familiar? The aligned soul doesn't expose you to break you. It reflects you so you can finally become whole. When two souls are aligned by God, something subtle but profound begins to happen internally. Chaos gives way to order, not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because the inner world becomes oriented. Jung spoke often about the danger of psychological fragmentation, when desires, fears, and values pull a person in opposing directions. In divine alignment, that fragmentation starts to resolve. Decisions no longer feel paralyzing because both individuals are moving under a shared hierarchy of values. There is less internal noise, less second guessing, less compulsive searching for meaning in the wrong places. Spiritually, this reflects submission to a higher order. When two people align not merely with each other, but with God, their actions gain coherence. Conflict still exists, but it becomes purposeful rather than destructive. Suffering doesn't vanish, but it gains direction. You begin to sense that your efforts matter, that your sacrifices are contributing to something larger than personal gratification. This is why aligned relationships often bring clarity rather than intensity. The nervous system calms because the psyche is no longer at war with itself, and that inner stability becomes a foundation from which real growth can occur. So if a connection brings order where there was confusion, structure where there was drift, and direction where there was doubt, recognize its significance. Order is not the absence of struggle. It is the alignment that makes struggle meaningful. When God aligns two souls, separation often becomes part of the process, and this is the aspect few people are prepared for. Alignment does not simply add, it removes. Psychologically, this resembles what Jung described as the necessary death of outdated structures. Patterns, relationships, and attachments that once provided stability can no longer survive when a higher order is introduced. What no longer aligns begins to feel heavy, discordant, even obstructive. This is not punishment, it is protection. Spiritually, pruning is an act of precision. God does not sever connections carelessly. He removes what competes with purpose or distorts truth. That is why these separations are painful yet clarifying. You are forced to see which bonds were rooted in fear, convenience, or identity rather than calling. And here lies the discipline. Resisting this process prolongs suffering, but accepting it restores integrity. Aligned souls cannot flourish while entangled in misaligned commitments. Unity demands focus. This is why what remains after separation is often quieter, fewer but stronger. The structure becomes resilient because it is no longer diluted. So if certain doors are closing as others open, do not rush to reopen what has been released. Ask instead what is being protected. Growth often begins where unnecessary attachments end, and alignment endures only when we have the courage to let go of what no longer belongs.